The battle for Kaith Prime should have ended with fire, silence, and forgetting. It was the kind of war that left cities eaten to their roots and skies smeared in smoke thick enough to silence gods. Sergeant Thanvar had fought from the first breach to the last bunker, a Terran shock trooper covered in soot and scars, with no medals left to give. His squad was gone, his cums were dead, and when the final artillery strike cracked open the obsidian ridge, he didn't expect to find anything but corpses. But instead, he found her, half buried under steel debris and alien flora wilted from the impact. She lay with one leg mangled and her chest plate seared. Her armor was not standard, it was ceremonial, carved with silver veins and adorned with sigils vaguely recognized from military briefings. Royal crests. He approached cautiously, rifle up, as sharp, until her fingers twitched. Then she opened her eyes, pale violet and blazing with indignation even through pain. Terran, she rasped, put your gun down or end it, but do not stare at me like a scavenger. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, slung his rifle behind him, and knelt. You're not dying here, he said flatly. She coughed, bitter and regal even in collapse. You don't even know who I am. I don't need to. He pulled a beam off her torso and slipped his arms under her without asking permission. She protested, of course half-heartedly, because the other half of her had already surrendered to the pain. Her head fell against his chest as he rose, and for the first time Fane noticed that her crown was broken, half melted into her hair. Royalty, yes, but now just a wounded woman in his arms. As he trudged through the ash winds of the dying night, she whispered once, not in defiance but exhaustion, "You're a fool." He smirked grimly. Better a fool who walks than a queen who dies. She didn't respond after that, only clutched his jacket as if it were a throne she might never see again. He carried her through deserts turned to glass and forests stripped of color by the war. His legs ached, his ribs screamed from a plasma burn he hadn't even bandaged, but he never slowed. The stars overhead were dim and distant, mocking him with their stillness. Every few hours she'd wake and murmur something sharp or strange, as if testing whether he still carried her out of duty or madness. You missed the signal beacon, she snapped once, gesturing to a ruin half buried in sand 3 kilometers behind. He didn't turn. Signal beacons attract scavengers. Are you always this stubborn? No, only when I carry dying royalty who refuse to say thank you. She went quiet again, but her grip on his shoulder tightened. On the third night, he found shelter inside a broken temple dome collapsed from orbital fire. He laid her down gently and started patching what wounds he could with med gel and salvaged nanite packs. The leg was a mess, charred bone and synthetic muscle. Her breathing was shallow, lips bloodless, but her eyes never dimmed. When he touched the edge of her crown to see if it could be removed without harming her scalp, her hands shot up and gripped his wrist. Don't. I need to stop the burn spreading. She held his gaze, the queen in her still alive. It's all I have left. He nodded, understanding in a way she didn't expect, and carefully worked around it. After he finished, she looked at him as though seeing something not even she had planned for. Why are you doing this? Fane leaned against the wall, arms crossed over a chest that rose with fatigue. Because you were left behind, he answered, and I don't leave people behind. She studied him for a long moment, then without her usual venom, she asked, what's your name? Fane. Syrah, she whispered in return. Queen of the Obsidian Crescent. He blinked not in awe, but in understanding. It wasn't her title that moved him. It was the realization that she had finally trusted him with her truth. And somehow, that was heavier than carrying her across a planet. As she drifted into sleep, he whispered, you're not alone anymore. And though she didn't reply, a single tear ran down her ash-streaked cheek and vanished into the dust. By the time the Terran evac vessel descended into the smoke-choked valley, Fane had already begun to dream differently, not of medals, not of promotion, not of the long silence that haunted veterans, but of her, Surendra. Her name was a blade tucked under his ribs now, not painful, but always present, always whispering that this mission had become something more than survival. The evac team didn't expect a living queen. They rushed him first, asking questions, shoving data pads into his chest, demanding confirmation of enemy warlords he had never cared to memorize. But then she was wheeled out of the temple ruins, still unconscious but breathing stronger now, and the silence was instant. No one had ever seen the bloody Crescent Queen in chains, let alone in a Terran soldier's arms, sleeping like a broken phoenix. They wanted to separate them, protocol, intelligence, threat assessment. But she woke before they could, and with only one weak gesture from her gloved hand, she beckoned Thane close. He stays with me, she rasped. He is mine. The command in her voice chilled everyone. She hadn't said it as a queen claiming property, but as a woman reclaiming what fate had almost taken. They flew in silence, but Thane never left her side, not when the medics fussed over her ribs, not when the council demanded she be sedated, and not even when the High Tribunal issued a formal statement warning that any alliance with her bloodline was an act of strategic recklessness. To all of that, he said nothing. His presence was his answer. On the third night in orbit, as she lay healing beneath Terran nanop fabric sheets, she turned her head toward him, brows still furrowed with grief. I thought I'd die on that battlefield, Thane. I wanted to. He didn't flinch. She added softly, but you made dying feel like a betrayal. He placed a hand on hers, and the galaxy shifted, not because of a treaty, not because of war, but because in that moment, the most feared woman in 3 systems had allowed herself to hope again. Weeks passed in the neutral sanctuary orbiting Lrazbel, a station that spun in quiet exile away from politics and planetary eyes. The doctors said Surendra would walk again, though her leg required cybernetic reinforcement and her lungs would always carry faint damage from Carrot's sulfur storms. She took it all with the same cold grace she had worn on the battlefield. But it was different now, less about pride, more about endurance. She didn't have to command rooms anymore. She only had to heal. And somehow, that was harder. Thane visited her every morning, carrying black root tea and tan sunfruit. She always scowled at the tea, sipped it anyway, then watched him like she was cataloging the way he breathed. One day she asked, "Do your people always treat their enemies like this?" He replied, "Only the ones who bleed like us." That made her pause. Then she smiled just once. They took walks through the hydro gardens when she could stand. The artificial sunlight was weak, but Surendra always tilted her face toward it as if daring the warmth to stay. When he asked her what she saw out there in the long black void of exile, she replied, 1,000 voices I once silenced. Then softer, and one voice that pulled me back. The station was quiet, but political tension boiled beneath its surface. Several alien dignitaries had caught wind that she was still alive and not in chains. It was unacceptable to them, a living reminder of wars they'd paid to forget. Some demanded extradition, others suggested assassination. Surendra knew this, and yet she stayed, not out of pride, but for him. Because with Thane beside her, she felt something unfamiliar to her bloodline, safety. But safety is always temporary. On the eve of the 6th week, Surendra collapsed during a garden walk. Thane caught her before she hit the floor, eyes wide with panic as her breathing grew shallow, her skin flushed in strange ultraviolet patches. Medical officers flooded the corridor. He wasn't allowed to follow past the quarantine doors. Hours passed. The walls pulsed with emergency lights, his fists clenched and unclenched. Then finally, the chief medic stepped out, expression unreadable. "She's stable," he said, "but there's something else." Thane's heart slowed. "She's pregnant." Silence swallowed him. "It's early, but the signs are clear. A hybrid gestation." She never knew, probably assumed it was post-trauma fatigue. The words barely reached him. His thoughts spiraled into every quiet moment they'd shared, every touch, every look that lingered too long, every breath they had not dared name. He ran to her room. She lay in silence, eyes half-lidded, breathing slowly, still too weak to speak. But when she saw him, a single tear escaped the edge of her eye. He knelt beside her bed, reached for her hand, and whispered, "We'll protect this together." And for the first time in her life, the Queen of the Obsidian Crescent didn't answer with pride or command or challenge. She only nodded once and pressed his hand to her abdomen. The news of her pregnancy was a dagger slipped beneath the skin of the galaxy, silent at first, then spreading shock waves like sonic fire. None of the major powers had prepared for it. A child conceived between the heir of the Obsidian Crescent and a Terran war hero was not just an anomaly. It was a threat to everything they had built upon: division, fear, and ancient bloodlines. A hybrid born of two enemies wasn't supposed to exist, let alone flourish. Surendra lay in a still-lit infirmary, her strength returning faster than the medics predicted. Her body was built for war, but her soul, it seemed, had softened in ways no scanner could chart. She stared often at the ceiling, hands resting on her stomach like a silent promise. She didn't ask to see the scans. She didn't ask for projections. She just closed her eyes and listened. Thane visited every day, though now he didn't bring tea or fruit. He brought his quiet presence and the look of a man who had stepped into something bigger than command. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but he moved like someone holding a glass world in his hands, uncertain where it would crack. "You're too calm," she said one day, voice low. "I'm a soldier," he answered. "I've walked through hell. What's a child compared to that?" She turned her head. "You've never raised a child born from two worlds that hate each other." His mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Later that night, as Surendra slept, Thane sat by the window of her private suite, watching ships pass through the misted lens of the outer dome. He'd seen so many types of war battles fought for minerals, borders, ideologies. But this would be the first war waged over the idea of someone not yet born. And the enemy wouldn't be flags or fleets. It would be silence, sabotage, diplomacy wrapped in venom, and rumors that tore at the child's soul before it could speak. When Surendra woke in the middle of the night from a pain that turned out to be harmless cramping, she found him asleep on the floor beside the bed, hands still gripping the leg of the chair like he refused to let it drift. She slid down carefully, wrapped a blanket over his shoulders, and curled beside him, letting her breath match his. The war would come, but not before they taught each other how to be more than survivors. By the time Surendra could walk freely again, her presence on the station was no longer a rumor but a crisis wrapped in formal restraint. Delegates from 3 systems had already arrived in veiled panic, hiding behind peace offers that stank of thinly veiled exile requests. She met none of them. She remained behind pressure-sealed doors, observing from her private hollow screens, memorizing their nervous body language and false smiles. Her former rivals had expected her to disappear, to die in glorious martyrdom on Kaith, or at least fade into obscurity like a retired empress haunted by ghosts. But she had not vanished. She had grown, literally. And with each scan of the growing life inside her, the galaxy's fear turned into something less predictable. Uncertainty. They couldn't kill her now. They couldn't assassinate the child without collapsing any claim to morality they still had left. Thane trained every morning in the combat dome, sweat painting his shirt, blades ringing off synthetic targets. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming something else, a shield, not for a nation, but for a woman and an unborn future. When Surendra stood at the edge of the arena one morning, visibly swelling with life, and watched him move with calculated rage, she knew there would never be a fortress safer than the man standing in the sand below. "You're not afraid they'll come after you?" she asked later that day as she braided her silver hair, a warrior's habit she refused to break. "I'm counting on it," Thane replied. "That way I get to choose where the fight happens. You sound more like me every day. And you?" He paused, resting a hand gently against her stomach. "You're not who you used to be either." She didn't reply. She only pulled him close, forehead resting against his chest, and together they listened to the subtle rhythm of a second heartbeat between them. The child wasn't due for months, but already he was the most valuable being in the quadrant. Threat assessments doubled. Offers of sanctuary flooded in, all of them riddled with terms and protections that stank of ownership. So they made a choice. They would leave the station quietly, without fanfare or escort, and vanish among the debris rings of a long-dead moon, called Draxel 3, where Thane's old war comrades had built a hidden outpost for recovery. It was Spartan, icy, and barren but safe, and it was theirs. That night, as the ship drifted toward the dark belt, Surendra stood at the viewport, hands resting over her belly. "When he comes," she whispered, "we will not raise him as royalty. We will raise him as truth, something no flag or throne can corrupt." Thane came up behind her, arms around her shoulders, lips close to her temple. "No crown," he agreed, "unless he forges it himself." Outside, the stars watched in silence, old kings dying, old empires crumbling. But inside that ship, something entirely new was learning to breathe. The outpost on Draxel 3 wasn't made for comfort. It was a tomb of ice and steel buried beneath. The planet's surface, once a forward listening post during the cold Quasar conflict, now it was theirs. No throne room, no velvet corridors, just narrow corridors that moaned under the weight of frozen winds and walls lit by flickering backup power relays. But here, away from the watching eyes of dying kings and conniving diplomats, Surendra began to smile again. The pregnancy changed her slowly, not just in body, but in posture. She no longer walked like a predator in waiting, but like a shield growing beneath winter stars. She would still train in the morning slow motions designed to keep her muscles ready, her instincts sharp, but afterward, she would sit with Thane beside the reclaimed geothermal furnace, sipping broth made from reconstituted protein paste, laughing at his stories of Terran farm raids and awkward barrack dances. There were no advisors to warn her against lowering her guard, no voice in her ear reminding her of legacy or war, just the hum of quiet machines and the pulse of life inside her. Thane had started carving a cradle from the remnants of old weapons lockers, metal once meant to house death, now shaped to hold beginning. His hands were calloused and awkward, but when she saw what he was doing, she didn't stop him. She watched him as though he was crafting not wood and metal, but meaning. In the evenings, they lay together on an old repurposed med cot to narrow for two people, but perfect in its closeness. She would rest her hand in his, and he would speak soft words she didn't always understand, Terran lullabies, childhood nonsense, hope spoken into the dark. Their child kicked sometimes as if answering him. Every moment between them became sacred, and yet, even sacred spaces are not safe forever. The signal came through the long-range whisper line, bouncing across defunct satellites in a code only Thane's former command network would recognize. A single sentence pulls through the transmission. They found you. Prepare for breach within 3 rotations. Thane stared at the blinking interface, jaw clenched. Surendra stepped into the room as he turned off the screen. She had known the look in his eyes even before the war. Is it them? She asked, voice low. Yes. Then we don't run. No, he said quietly, stepping toward her. We don't. She nodded once and turned, lifting the cover off the old weapons cache. Inside were 2 relics of broken empires, her reforged crescent blade and his Terran pulse rifle, cleaned and rebuilt from spare parts over quiet months. She handed him his rifle without a word. He handed her the blade like it belonged in her hand more than any crown ever did. As they stood, their warriors cloaked in silence and purpose, the child stirred again. Neither flinched. They came without warning, as promised, though they was not one enemy but many, a coalition of assassins and saboteurs from across 3 rival factions. Exiles from the Ember Court, rogue elements from the Varnari Compact, and bounty hunters with no flag at all. They breached the outpost under the cover of an electrical storm, unaware that the 2 most dangerous people in the quadrant were already waiting for them. Thane took the upper tunnels, weaving through shadows, and Echo, pulse rifle in his hands, like it was an extension of his soul. Every corner he turned, every angle he covered, he moved not as a soldier fulfilling orders but as a father defending his future. He didn't call for backup, there was no backup. There was only the oath he had carved into his spine the day Surendra looked at him and trusted him to carry all of it. Surendra fought in the lower halls, where ice crept across the walls and wind howled like a mourning god. She was slower than before. Yes, her form altered by pregnancy, but her aim was precise and her mind lethal. She used the blade only when necessary. Most of the time, it was the environment itself she used. Collapsing tunnels, rerouting thermal ducts, channeling heat into frozen shafts that exploded into walls of steam and blinding shrapnel. One by one, the attackers fell not because they were outgunned, but because they were not prepared to face a mother and a father fighting not for titles, not for thrones, but for the child the galaxy wanted to erase before he took his first breath. And in the heart of the fight, something unspoken happened. They moved as one. Every time Thane covered her blind side, every time she threw her blade past him to stop an attacker he didn't see, they became more than lovers, more than warriors. They became a single will forged from 2 shattered empires. The final wave breached the command dome, where the old generators hummed like dying beasts. Surendra was cornered low on breath, blood trailing down her side. 3 enemies approached, their weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind red gold. Masks of her own exiled elite, the very warriors she had once commanded. They did not hesitate, but before they could fire, Thane appeared from the side tunnel, rage written in every line of his body. He fired 3 times, not just to kill, but to declare, "You do not touch what is mine." When the last of them fell, silence overtook the station. It wasn't peaceful, it was sacred. Thane dropped to one knee beside her, breath ragged. Her hands clutched his shirt as he helped her up, blood on both of them, and yet neither looked away from the other. "You said we don't run," he whispered. "We never will," she replied, and kissed him before the smoke cleared. Behind them, the Pulse Cradle remained untouched, not a single scratch. In the days that followed the siege, the outpost on Draxel 3 became something else entirely, not a battlefield, not a ruin, but a cradle for new beginnings forged in the aftershock of blood. Thane patched the walls with his bare hands, one steel panel at a time, while Surendra rested in the inner chamber, her body aching but steady, her spirit coiled in something fierce and almost maternal. No fleet arrived. No reinforcements came. The galaxy expected them to be dead or captured, but neither outcome came to pass. Instead, they began to live. Word spread slowly through old resistance channels, whispers of an unborn hybrid, of an exiled queen and a Terran soldier who fought off 3 elite squads without losing each other. Some said it was impossible. Others called it propaganda. But among the people, those crushed beneath the weight of old regimes and fading flags, hope began to bloom like fire in winter. For if they could survive, perhaps unity was not only possible but already here. Surendra sat on the edge of her cot one morning, cradling her belly with a hand still callous from war. She had not spoken to Thane yet that day, not because there was distance, but because the silence between them had turned sacred. She was no longer afraid of what she was becoming. The queen, the killer, the weapon of blood, those were past lives. In this cold bunker, carved out of a forgotten war, she was something she had never been in her entire reign, a woman who could be loved without condition. Thane entered the room with a bowl of broth in one hand and a makeshift necklace in the other, a string of laser-sanded crystals he had collected from the outpost's solar prism array. "For you," he said gruffly, placing it in her hand without explanation. She looked down at the crude, sparkling thing. "Is this a Terran tradition?" "No," he replied. "It's just what I had." And somehow, that was everything. That night, as snow drifted across the outer dome and the ice winds howled, Surendra went into labor. It was too early, the medbots were offline and the old infirmary lights kept flickering out, but Thane never left her side. Even when she screamed like the old gods were tearing open the sky, she broke 2 of his fingers in the process. He didn't complain once. When the child was born red-skinned like her, with faint Terran eyes, the world stopped. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket, and she held him close to her chest, trembling. For the first time in centuries, the former queen of the Obsidian Crescent cried not from pain, but from peace. It was Thane who named the child, not with ceremony, not with the chanting of planets or signatures of warlords, but with a whisper spoken into the hush between the mother's heartbeat and the snow tapping at steel. "Kale," he said, brushing the child's tiny cheek with one bruised finger. "It means flame that never fades." Surendra repeated the name like a vow, her voice barely audible but iron-etched. Kale. He would carry no throne behind him, no prophecy to shackle him, only the legacy of 2 people who refused to bow, who chose each other in the face of a galaxy that demanded separation. In the following weeks, they buried the dead outside the dome and installed new shielding on the outposts. Perimeter. Messages arrived but went unanswered. Draxel 3 did not show up on any new star maps. No beacon pulls from their location. They had vanished from politics, from war, from every history book desperate to define them. And yet, small caravans began to arrive, not diplomats, not spies, families, refugees from fallen colonies, soldiers with nowhere to return, even enemy combatants who no longer believed in the wars they once fought. They came not because of a flag, but because of what they had heard whispered from debris fields and coded bursts, that somewhere in the ice, a queen once known as the Bloody Crescent had chosen mercy, that a human warrior had laid down his rifle and picked up a child, that a fire had started not to burn down empires, but to warm those left behind. Thane and Surendra didn't ask questions. They opened the doors. Over time, the outpost changed. Steel walls were lined with books, with murals drawn by alien children, with gardens built into old cooling shafts. Weapons were melted down and reforged into tools. The cradle became a nursery. The command center turned into a school. Draxel 3 became something no warlord could define: home. Kale grew quickly curious and sharp-eyed, speaking both languages by the time he could walk. He called Thane father. He called Surendra mother. He knew nothing of fear, only of the strength that lives in stillness and the love that refuses to be commanded. One evening, as they all sat beneath the aurora-streaked dome, Kale asked his parents, "Were you ever afraid?" Thane laughed. "Every day." Surendra looked at Thane, then at the child resting between them. "But we never ran." Kale leaned against them, his small hand resting over the scar on Thane's knuckle, and closed his eyes to sleep. Outside, the galaxy turned as it always had. But within the frozen breath of Draxel 3, something eternal remained lit, not a crown, not a war, but a family, quiet and fierce and unbroken.